No sooner is 2020 over and the race for 2024 begins. It's possible, too, that we will see a familiar face in those presidential primaries, Donald Trump. Except this time around, Trump might not be running on the Republican Party's ticket. Instead, he and some of his supporters have suggested that they will fashion a new political party, perhaps dubbed the Patriot Party or MAGA Party. Either way, one that more fully embraces Trump's politics. On the one hand, this political calculation does make some sense. Many Americans, 57% in 2020 according to Gallup, think a third major party is needed. And there is some evidence that if there were more than two parties, for instance, if the Democratic Party and Republican Party each split in two, many Americans would identify with one of those new parties. Take what a recent NBC News survey found. Evenly sliced groups of registered voters fell into four separate parties, with GOP voters split on whether they identified more with Trump or the traditional Republican Party, and Democrats divided on who they supported in the 2020 Democratic presidential primary. However, that poll may be missing some support for another potential party or two, as nearly one-third of registered voters said they did not fall into any of those four groups, indicating that there could be some support for a five-party system, which other pollsters such as Echelon Insights and The Economist YouGov have broken out with their polling data in recent years. But should we really expect the Democrats and Republicans to splinter and form new political parties anytime soon? In all likelihood, no. Creating a new political party requires significant financial and organizational investment, not to mention overcoming many obstacles like our winner-take-all electoral system that usually blocks minor parties from gaining ground in government. Now, all of that being said, let's start with the mechanics of our elections and why they discourage the growth of third parties. The simple fact is that in most national and state elections, the candidate who wins the most vote wins the election. As such, a candidate who wins a small but meaningful share of the vote, say 15%, does not win anything in the United States, unlike in other countries that use proportional representation in elections, such as the Netherlands. And this, in turn, has encouraged a broad coalition-driven two-party system in the US. Remember, the goal of parties is to control the government and make policies that they and their voters support. So given the way our elections work, it would be self-defeating for the parties to not unite under a relatively broad coalition. After all, a failure to bring together like-minded groups could just hand victory to the other side. That being said, it is true that other countries with plurality election rules like ours do have notable third parties with long-standing national appeal, such as the New Democratic Party in Canada or the Liberal Democrats in the United Kingdom. So why don't we have a two-and-a-half-party system in the US? It turns out that American third parties are further limited by another plurality-based electoral component that those other countries don't have: presidential elections decided by the Electoral College. Almost every state in the US uses a winner-take-all approach for awarding electoral votes, whereby the winning candidate will get all of the electoral votes by finishing first, regardless of whether that is with 70% or 35% of the vote. So, in other words, the electoral system for our most high-profile national office makes it even more imperative to stitch together large coalitions. For instance, if the GOP were to split fairly evenly because of a Trump-led alternative, the result would likely be Democratic victories across most states. And that includes states as red as Alabama or Utah, where President Biden only won about 37% of the vote last November. For historical reference, consider what happened in the 1912 election, when a conservative-progressive split in the GOP between President William Taft and Progressive Party nominee Theodore Roosevelt allowed Democrat Woodrow Wilson to win all but 8 states despite winning only 42% of the vote nationally, including a state like Massachusetts, which Wilson carried with just 36% of the vote. So even if Trump did lead a third-party exodus from the GOP ahead of 2024, and polls have suggested such a party could attract meaningful support, the reality is that such a split would probably not be successful and would likely compel a Republican reconciliation in some form afterward. That said, the lack of a meaningful third party in the US isn't entirely due to the electoral system. The Democratic and Republican parties have also sought to protect their position by making it harder for other parties to contest elections. For example, many states have inconvenient and difficult ballot access laws that require a large number of signatures or extensive filing fees. This makes things even more challenging for third parties as they have a harder time raising money, finding volunteers, paying workers, and getting enough signatures to qualify to appear on a ballot than their Democratic and Republican counterparts. And as a result of these challenges, it's more difficult for minor parties to even be up for consideration in November, much less win. Furthermore, American voters' strong attachment to the major parties has also limited the ability of third parties to grow. Although a large share of voters claim that they are independent, the reality is that roughly 9 in 10 Americans identify with one of the two major parties, and by large, that has been the case for decades. And if you add in the deep divides in our current political environment, the status quo does not look likely to change anytime soon, especially as the risk of wasting a vote on a candidate with little chance of winning could actually help the party a voter dislikes win. And off the back of that, it's difficult for third parties to win more than a small sliver of the vote in most presidential elections, as this chart shows. On average, Democrats and Republicans have won 95% of the total vote in elections since the Civil War. And even when a third party has made a big splash like Roosevelt's bid in 1912 or Ross Perot's independent run in 1992, it rarely has had any staying power. In some cases, the major parties captured most of the third-party supporters, as was the case of the Progressives after Roosevelt's 1912 campaign. Or another scenario is that the issue that drove a party's formation faded in importance, as was true of the Perot-inspired Reform Party, whose populist appeal was dulled by the economic boom of the late 1990s. And lastly, as the Reform Party also demonstrated, party infighting whittled away potential support. Regardless, though, of what crippled a third party, the bottom line is this. No third party has won at least 10% of the national popular vote in 2 consecutive presidential elections. Finally, the conditions that have sparked past major third-party movements, that is, deep dissatisfaction with the two parties or an insurgent divide within one of the parties, hasn't really happened today. It is true that there is currently a lot of dissatisfaction with the two major parties, but Democrats and Republicans continue to hold positive views of their party while their attitudes toward the opposition sour more and more. And whereas disagreements over the GOP's ideological direction led to the famous 1912 split, it's hard to see the reason for such a divide in today's GOP. Yes, some Republican leaders dislike Trump, but as the NBC News poll showed, Donald Trump is still adored by 99% of Republicans who identify with him. And he's even fairly well liked, 78%, by Republicans who identify more with the party than him. In other words, Trump's standing within the party does not offer much of a reason for Trump or his supporters to leave it. Of course, we can't know when another significant third-party movement might pop up, but at this current juncture, it is unlikely that we'll see one in the near future. As for Trump himself, he may run for president again in 2024, and by then, his party might be ready to move on from him. But if he does run, his best bet to retake the White House would appear to be as the standard bearer of a united GOP, not as the head of a new party. That is all for today's video, though. I hope you all enjoyed. Please make sure to follow EP Official on all of my social medias linked in the description down below. Also, make sure to comment your thoughts and opinions in the comment section down below. And please hit the like button if you liked the video as well. Subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you all so much for watching. Check out more content from my channel here, and as always, tune in next time. EP out.